Hello everyone, this is Amir from Audio Science Review. Back to reviewing products. This is a speaker I just tested and I thought I'd share with you in video as well as the text review that's out. It's the Bowers Wilkins 607 S2 Anniversary Edition. It's a bookshelf speaker that was sent by a member to me. Cost about $700 and is only sold through their dealers. At least I didn't think. I saw it on Amazon and what have you. Before I do reviews or while I'm doing the measurements, I usually go hunt around for other reviews. There are hardly any on this anniversary edition or even the S2 version. I found a couple. One is this British What Hi-Fi site, and they raved about it. 5 stars, and improved clarity and detail, more expressive. A tighter, more agile bass. One wonders what those things mean. And nothing negative at this price, really. Very surprising. Steve Guttenberg reviewed this product twice. He did a review of it, and then he picked it as Speaker of the Year for last year. I think he picked 2 speakers. This was one of the 2. And I'll let you go and watch his video. So the praise seems to be unanimous, at least as far as you can go with just 2 reviews. But of course, they don't properly evaluate the speaker, in my opinion. They don't do any objective analysis, and heaven knows how their subjective analysis is going. You know, they just play some music and comment on how they felt at the end. Anyway, this speaker comes in different colors. The version I had was in black. You can see it back here, sitting here. I guess it looks all right. I can't say it looks any more exceptional than any other speaker. Has this grill on top of a tweeter that seems to be becoming common with a few companies using them, ELAC and B&W here, and I think a Paradigm speaker used them. Some people call them sink drain hole mesh or something, because it sort of looks like that, but they look nicer than that. The corners are unfortunately quite sharp, and the reason that matters is that they get diffraction. The sound wave, as they hit in here, they start to generate their own little mini speakers around these corners. And, you know, you're starting to get to a price at $700 that you expect somebody to at least round over the edges of these cabinets and use thick enough material to allow that kind of round over to happen. So it doesn't look ugly, but I don't think it looks like a luxury product, which it should, because you can get bookshelf speakers for $120, $150 in this size. So when you pay $700, you expect more. I'd say the back, actually, it looks more attractive to me. This very large flared port, and very clever design from a manufacturing point of view, in that they took this cup, this plastic cup, and integrated it with the port, so they had to pay for tooling only once, and for assembly it's easy. You just snap this whole thing in there, screw it in, and you got both things in there. I was a little surprised to see these binding posts not being in gold coating. Not that it matters much, but that seems to be the norm to you know, give a feeling of luxury on that, but they passed on it. I don't know how many people try to buy wire these things, but there it is. Speakers manufactured in China, as just about every speaker below $1,000 usually is, and even above $1,000. So nothing against that, as long as they have their own supervision of how things get manufactured in China, it should be fine on this thing. So if you haven't seen or read about my speaker measurements, which is what I lead with and then get into listening tests, I use what's called a near-field scanner from one of the leaders in driver and speaker design and analysis, a company called Klippel in Germany. They make this robotic scanner, which I've purchased. You put the speaker on it, and then this arm moves the microphone, measurement microphone that you can see, goes up and down, and makes a scan all the way around. It actually does it twice. And by doing that, it's able to get a full 3D representation of the sound waves around the speaker, and then you can query the software and say, give me the response at this position in 3D space, you know, at any arbitrary position. Use about 1,000 measurement points. You can pick that, and that's my standard for typical speakers. And that takes about 2.5 hours and another half hour of signal processing time on my fast PC to generate the sound field and the measurements you're going to see. Using the system, you don't need an anechoic chamber, and you don't even need a quiet room because it makes measurements very close to the speakers, so ambient noise gets excluded a lot. So going back to the measurements, that entire 3D set of measurements gets summarized into what we call a spin graph or spinorama. This term comes from Harman that started this innovation, and before that, research done by Dr. Floyd Toole at Canadian Research Council, and where they took all the measurements in, you know, directly looking at the speaker, but also above and below vertically, and also horizontally, 72 measurement points. And then they summarize them into a bunch of graphs in here, so it's a lot easier to analyze than looking at 72 frequency response measurements. So the solid line that you see says on axis is the most important one because that's the main sound that directly comes from the speaker and hits your ear first. All the other sounds have to reflect from wall or multiple surfaces before they come to your ear. So if we look at the on-axis response, what we want to see is a neutral speaker and with no ups and downs as much as a speaker can be. Here, unfortunately, we see the exact opposite of it. If you look in here, we have some kind of irregularity here, which is unusual. Then we have another chunk over here that goes up. Whenever you see these curves follow the same kind of peaking, that means there's a resonance there. That means if you tap on something, it'll ring on its own, and that colors the sound. So we know we have a resonance here, we have a resonance here, and then we get a hole in what should be the crossover region. And the number one job of a crossover designer is to design those two curves for the woofer and the tweeter to average out to be a flat response, not have a hole in it. Very puzzling why people still make speakers with this kind of hole in it. And then the response shoots way up, another resonance here around 5 or 6 kilohertz, and then another one up here, probably tweeter itself, potentially. And at any rate, this entire region is elevated above 1,000 to 3,000 hertz or so. So just looking at this, I can tell you the speaker's not going to be neutral. It's going to impart this tonality on everything you play. And it's hard to imagine that every recorded music in the world comes with an inverse of this graph so that this correction makes it sound neutral. It's about, you know, is it the worst I've seen? Probably not, but I'd say it's probably ranks way down there as far as how bad it is. So that's the first thing I look at, this on-axis response. And then the second one is this early reflections. Those are the most important and loudest reflections that also arrive at your ear and combine with a direct sound. So if they are very different in tonality than the on-axis response, then they can actually shift the tonality and potentially be, you know, something that's not as pleasant to your ear. The ear wants to ignore those reflections because they're delayed in time and can be confusing. And the brain wants to filter them out because it's not additional information about what the source of sound is. But to the extent they have their own tonality and what have you, it can't do that. So, excuse me, let's look at the this early reflection here and up here, the blue, and you can see it in this dashed line. This dashed line ideally would be the same distance from this from on axis all the way, but we can see in some places it actually gets very close to it, and in some places it's farther away. So it is not tracking it 100%. This has a consequence in that when on-axis is wrong, we can use equalization to pull that up, but we can't change this relationship between the on and off-axis response of a speaker because our equalization is upstream of a speaker. We can't control the tonality of the sound that only goes sideways from it. We only have one electrical input to the speaker, and two things or multiple things come out of it, and that's a bad thing. It means equalization potentially doesn't work well, whether you do it manually or automatically through an AVR and what have you. on this thing. Very low efficiency as speakers go. Average speaker that I test is 85 to 86 dB efficiency. I'm measuring about 83 over here. The company advertises 84, which is very honest. Usually companies like Klipsch will go pick this peak up here and say that is the efficiency, say it's 90 dB over here. Should be just crazy wrong. Most power you need for a speaker to drive it is in low frequencies, and this is what matters here, how loud you can make this. And so inefficient speaker, despite being little, don't be fooled thinking you can get a little 10 watt amplifier to drive it. It's not gonna play that well. Okay, I talked about the early reflection. Again, we can actually look at what goes into every early reflections. Is reflections from floor, ceiling, front wall, side walls, rear walls, and then the special sum of all these things together, we get this curve. We can see that this curve is, you know, as gnarly as the on-axis one, but again, it's not identical to it. It's just not good. You don't want to see this kind of messiness in here. Now, if you want to improve this messiness, you can look at the individual components and see which one you should put an absorber on and potentially improve the situation. Like if the floor reflections were bad, you can put a thick carpet on the floor. Here, I couldn't find any of these curves that I would want to take out and to fix anything, because you take it out and there's some areas of the curve of whichever reflection is doing some good, some areas is not doing good. Usually I try to fix this dip in here, but nothing is really in this area. Maybe sidewall reflections you could take out will improve, but the sidewall reflections are over here, and you know, and they have a beneficial effect actually of making the speaker become wider, not just be this point source, which is artificial. Anyway, the standard that we use allows us to take a combination of what's called the power response, which is the mostly low frequency dominant, and these early reflections and on-axis, and we can synthesize them and predict what a typical average room sound would be. So everything else I've shown you has been anechoic, which means no reflections, in an idealized situation where we're just looking at the speaker, not speaker and a room. This graph actually shows speaker and a room. So it says, look, most likely, if you put the speaker in a room, this is the sound you're going to get. Now, you could have weird rooms that don't match this, but it's surprisingly close, I should say. I've drawn a trend line by eye. Mathematically, you could put a line in there and figure it out. But if you just draw a line, and usually I try to match it in bass response, we're kind of okay in here, a few hundred hertz, and then we have a bump in here in upper hundreds of hertz. Then we have a dip. Then we have this massive peaking. So bulk of your music from a few hundred hertz on is going to be subjected to this fixed EQ, which I just can't imagine this being a, you know, a pleasant experience. Certainly anything up here means higher pitch and in extreme. The dip in here is in a very critical part of music. There's a lot of content in here. You don't want a spectrum in here in your music. You don't want to pull this down. This area that's up, some of it is actually good. It can contribute to a wider sound stage. Actually, this entire area does, sort of between 1 kilohertz and 3 kilohertz. The higher this is, the more sense of openness and sound stage you get, because it's high enough in frequency, but also it's an area where a lot of a channel separation exists in music. Bass usually is way mono. Highs are just so far inaudible, so low in level we don't care about. This area, I feel you got to get right, and this has a mix of good and bad in here, so very hard to synthesize what the end result would be. It's possible the reviewers who love this bigger sort of, you know, they were hearing this effect when they talk about, you know, soundstage, and then they could be fooled by what I call showroom sound, which is, you know, boost the crap out of the high frequencies, make it bright. In the first few seconds of listening to the speaker, it'll sound ultra detailed and refined, and we call that a showroom effect because in the old days, all these speakers would put on the shelf with a selector A/B switch. You just, you know, select them, and the speaker that was brightest, the, you know, classic Klipsch, would always win, and also louder because this area. And it's, I gotta tell you, it's captivating for a few seconds, even for a trained listener. At first, it sounds good, but longer term, this is where ear fatigue comes from, and you just don't, you know, it's like too much chocolate, too much sweet. A little bit is good in moderation, but not too much. One test I do is that I take the measurement microphone, and just make a single measurement very close to each driver and the port. That gives us a rough idea of what each one of them is doing, more or less independently. The entire speaker is playing still, so you get some bleeding effects. But here's the port, for example, in orange. It goes up in here, so the port tuning's around 50 hertz and provides that kick. And that's what the ports do, is that they give you some more low frequency response. And you can see the woofer was dying, well above that. So this provides a boost. But the drawback of the port is that the sound also that bounces up and down inside the cabinet, left and right, and in 3 dimensions, can create resonances of its own, proportional to those dimensions, if they're not well damped or well isolated. And instead of a sound continuing to just go down, all of a sudden it starts to go back because it builds up energy. And we can see a peak over here, and we see multiple peaks in here. And if you look at the woofer, you see that it's very clean response, but where does all this rockiness come from here, like this one and these? That all comes from port resonances. So that's why this jagged port response of the port is coming on. Now, good news is that the port's pointed in the back, so unless you put it very close to a wall, audibility of that is not very huge normally, but some of it is bleeding enough to show up in the on-axis response. The tweeters here, now the relative levels of these, I've manually adjust them, so not very accurate, but more or less you can see that the tweeter A doesn't have a fixed response in here. It sort of goes up and then goes back down and comes back down here. It doesn't have a clean, flat response to 20 kilohertz. It's got its own peaking over here. They could have just put a resistor in series with that and pulled that down and made it much more well-behaved. But, they're clearly aiming for this kind of bright sound. And the crossover, who knows what the crossover is? It looks kind of gentle slope to me rather than the steeper slopes that you want to have. When you don't have steeper slopes, you can see that the woofer has resonances over here, and those start to whack into the tweeter and cause jaggedness there. Although this one's fairly low, but you can see the woofer here isn't just nicely sloping down. It does, it has all this screwiness in here, and a sharper filter may have gotten rid of some of this weirdness in here. And some of these are out of phase, by the way, here, and they cause cancellations and that dip that we saw. I measured the phase and amplitude of the impedance, and here mostly what I usually note is how low the impedance gets. Is actually not bad. Most bookshelves go down to 4 ohms, 3.5 ohms. This one is 5 ohms and higher, so it's not going to require a very high current amplifier, but as I noted, it's an inefficient amp, so it's going to require more. Some power anyway. There are little kinks in here. I don't know if this comes across in video at all, but I'll show you the next graph where it does. Whenever there's little kinks in here, it means there's a resonance there. Again, resonance is where something inside all of a sudden captures energy and starts playing on its own louder, and that causes slightest tick in here. Usually I don't show this Csd Waterfall because it can be misleading and the parameters of it can make it look anything it wants. I'll probably do a video on this next. But here I showed because it looked pretty bad. You can see all these lines in here. Basically, we played something, but at certain frequencies it has no extension here. But at other frequencies, all of a sudden, you play the note and you stop and it'll keep going by itself. And if you keep playing, then it acts like as an amplifier and you get these peaks in here. And if you look in here, you can see it corresponds to peaks up there. So technically so far, boy, there's not a whole lot to hang your hat on. One of the things we look at is how wide of a beam horizontally and vertically the speaker generates. This is fairly typical, about plus or minus 60 degrees, probably most common that I find. But it's very hard to determine where you should draw the line. This is the red line that we look at where 6 dB is lost, 6 dB less loud than the on-axis sound. You can see that it's, a lot of chewed up response up here, then it goes okay, then it goes down, then it goes up, then it goes down, then it gets narrower again. Clearly there was no attempt made at regularizing these the woofer and the tweeter, for example, over here. Here we can see the woofer is getting narrow, and all of a sudden tweeter kicks in and is wider, and so the two have a mismatch. Why? Because we go back to our design. What should be in here, based on decades of research, is that you want to have a waveguide that narrows the response of that tweeter so at crossover points, so that when this guy hands the signal to the tweeter, how wide the beam is doesn't snap from one side to the other. And the woofer always gets beamier, gets narrower and narrower as the frequencies go up, and because of its size. And the tweeter being a lot smaller has the inverse. As soon as you hand it the signal, it's much smaller relative to the wavelength of music, the sound, so it then has a wider one. A waveguide limits that width of a tweeter to be only certain width, and it's missing in here. It's really not excusable at this price range. And we can see the penalty in here in this not being smooth. We can look at the same graph as a heat map, contour plot, and we can see the damage it's doing right around the crossover, how the beam width gets narrower, and also at the on-axis response, there's a lot of variations. The dark red in here means amplitude is higher, the highs, but here we see the amplitude is way down, and then it goes higher, then it goes lower. It's frankly a mess there. Vertically, it's odd as well. Usually two-way non-coaxials will not have the prettiest vertical directivity. Thankfully, directivity vertically is less important than horizontal one. I won't get into it now, but you still want to have as reasonable one as you can. I measured the speaker with my measurement microphone reference being the center of that tweeter. At the center of tweeter, you can see that you're right close to this area in blue and green, which means that the amplitude is much lower than it would be otherwise. What this says is that you want to sit above the tweeter level. So if you can, position the speaker where, it's sort of the sound is angling up 5 or 10 or 20 degrees. Do not go below. Don't put it at higher than your ear level and high on a bookshelf or something, sound pointing down, because you'll fall in this ditch where you get even a bigger dip in here vertically than what all of our assumptions have. Is it all bad news? No. If you look at the marketing material from them, they show very nice 3D analysis of the drivers and how they went from their older drivers that had more resonances and distortions to a cleaner new ones. And that shows, especially for your tweeter. I'll test the speaker at 2 levels of loudness at 1 meter, 3.3 feet, of 86 dB and 96 dB. At 86 dB, this tweeter is just for speakers, essentially distortionless. It's incredible. Even at 96 dB is below 0.5%, which is fantastic. This is what some of the best speakers do. Below 100 hertz, it's a little driver. It's going to get the woofer is going to get distorted. At 96 dB, the woofer is very unhappy. I shouldn't say very unhappy, but unhappy enough that the woofer is the weak link in here, as it would be, again, with small woofer like this. I show that that's percentages of distortion. We can also look at it absolute, and I draw a line at 50 dB SPL as my reference. I like to see everything below that. And at 86 dB, it gets there, no problem. This is a very low distortion speaker. At 96 dB on the right, this is typical with speakers, especially when they have a port, in that if you go below certain frequency tuning frequency of the port, all of a sudden the woofer loses control, and it actually generates more distortion than the tone itself that you told it to play. So I say distortion is greater than 100%. You do not want to have the speaker play that. So sometimes putting a high pass filter helps a lot. So if you have a subwoofer to go with this, you would put in that as 80 hertz or whatever anyway. And if you want to play it loud, that's mandatory. So a lot of times people ask me, why do I listen? I say, well, sometimes easy to determine what something sounds like. But if you look at the speaker with, highs and lows, in both regions, these regions, I can't give you exactly, an impression of what the sound would be. Generally, I said, yeah, it's bright in here, but what does this thing do? So I go and listen, and I always put the speaker in the exact same listening position and exact same set of tracks, exact same protocol. So tested some like 150 speakers that way, and not over 50 years. I've done that over a little over a year. So everything's fresh in my mind of, exactly what I'm expecting the sound to be. And I tell you, the first few seconds of this, the marketing angle worked perfectly. You hear this very detailed, high frequency, exaggerated sound that, because of low distortion level, is actually pleasing. It's not grating. There are speakers that are, have a lot of highs and have distortion that just immediately you want to, stop the music. Not so in here. But if you're at all trained or listen to any decent speaker, after a few seconds you say, whoa, this is nice. First of all, where's the bass? I could hardly hear the bass. I don't know how Steve Guttenberg says there's so much bass in here, you almost don't need a subwoofer. You're just not going to hear that bass when all these highs are so elevated. I couldn't hear any bass. I mean, it was just all mid to high frequencies, and that's what it was playing. And it just, it's just not pleasant. The other thing is, though, was that the little bit of bass that was there was this tubbiness. It was weird. There wasn't real bass, but there was some tubbiness. And I suspect the tubbiness comes from that elevated resonances that were in a few hundred hertz. That was giving the impression of bass, somewhat of an impression of bass, but it's the wrong bass because the resonances are not good. So I brought out my EQ tools in the Roon media player I use. What's nice about Roon is that it has a digital pipeline, and you can just turn on a signal processing module of your choice. In this case, I'm using Parametric EQ. Parametric EQ means I can pick a frequency that I want to have the highest attenuation or amplification, and I can set the width, and I can set how high that level is. So 3 parameters. It's got a frequency, and it's got the amplitude, and it's got the width, and this width is called the Q. And I'm showing you all the ones that I did. So working from the, working from the left to right, this is that first little dip that was at around 500 hertz. It's not very audible. It's just a slight amount, but I thought it got rid of that tubbiness and the boominess. Then we had a larger resonance. This is basically inverse of what you saw in the on-axis frequency response or the predicted in-room response. Brought that second resonance down. There was a hole there. I pulled the hole up. And then there was a resonance over here. I knocked that down. Wasn't enough. Then I had to put what is called a Sheldon Filter, where I take an entire region and bring it down. Once I did all this, it transformed the speaker. You did give up some of that, there was all these highs. Yeah, there were artificial highs. So you lose a little bit of that. This compensation where I'm pulling up the mid-range, it actually counters that pretty well. But it's now listenable. As soon as I did this, though, a new problem popped up, which I didn't put in the review, I forgot, which was all of a sudden, so now I'm taking all these levels down, so overall the speaker's less loud. So you now crank it up, and you actually hear bass. The bass comes in, but there is no dynamic headroom in that woofer. Once you turn it up and crank with some power, it bottoms out, and it bottoms out in a really nasty way. It goes, all of a sudden you lose control. So if you were going to do this, you'd need to put another high-pass filter in here and kill some of the deep lows. And the challenge with that is that when you do that, you actually lose some of your bass. And I didn't go there. At this point, I stopped. 5 filters is way too many filters to put in to fix a speaker that comes at a premium price of almost double of what another speaker would cost. Not only that, you're becoming a speaker designer. What speaker designer should have done was correct all this stuff and design a speaker that didn't need this much mucking around with. Here, you have to do that. You can start with my set, but I tell you, it's not perfect. Members, we have a senior member who does this mechanically, where he goes and creates a true inverse of that graph. That may work, may not work. Yet it's just, it's borderline unacceptable as far as what I would even do with, skill I have in trying to fix a speaker. The one of the issues I want to guard against is that I don't want to, our mood is not always the same. And you could wake up one day where, maybe you got allergies or something, as I often do. Maybe your high frequency hearing is shot, or maybe you're not in good mood. So I often, when I get something like this, I go ahead and put in one of the speakers that I know is not too expensive, but I know that it sounds good, just to say, what does this music really sound like when it's properly done? And I usually pull up this Revell M105 that's just sitting there ready to go. It's double the price, so don't get me wrong. But boy, I turned that on. I'm like, no EQ whatsoever. I'm like, this is what music's supposed to sound like. It's just, even with all my equalization, I did not get close to the sound that this produced. It was just a delight. I don't know. It's just they're not in the same planet, and and you can tell that from measurements I've shown you, and I can tell you in controlled listening with exact same speaker, exact same music, exact same position, that Revell, which follows 4 decades of research on what is a good speaker, just cleans the clocks of the speaker. So, that's what's done. Now, it didn't need to cost double the amount. B&W clearly has the technical chops to have designed a better crossover, to design a waveguide in there, better optimize the position of the two drivers, the cabinet, the corners, the diffraction. All of that is well within their means to do right. But either they're saving money, or they think this is a sound that sells, or some other motivation to build basically broken speakers. In their marketing material, they're saying the 600 series has sold 1 million units since inception in '94, whenever the first one came out. So I suspect they have this internal idea of continuing that. I don't know how good or bad the older generation sounded, but I can tell you this is not a speaker that should be on your buying list whatsoever, let alone be highly recommended, let alone be Speaker of the Year. Steve Guttenberg, what are you listening to? I mean, I'm not a spring chicken. My high frequency hearing is also reduced substantially. So when a speaker sounds so bright to me, how could it not sound bright to him? Is it that he has no high frequency left in his hearing, or that he doesn't follow a protocol, which I think likely the case? He keeps playing different music with every speaker. That is the wrong thing to do. If you keep playing different music that you don't know what parts of them are revealing, what parts of them bring out these issues, yeah, you can get music and you can play it on this speaker and you can go to town. There's plenty of good sounding music that will sound good on this, and it may sound great if you have no frame of reference. You don't have a protocol, you don't have a system for evaluating subjectively, and of course, you never did any measurements either. I have the luxury of cheating because the measurements tell me, hey, this is not a good speaker. Still, I should tell you, by the way, when I was evaluating the speaker, I did not have the measurements in front of me. I measured it all, but I did not extract the measurement. And I listened, and then once it noticed the brightness, I went back and pulled out the graph, and then I started building the EQ. But that's the benefit of measurement. It gives you a compass. It gives you a rudder. It says, look, there are issues here. Go listen for it. There are too much highs in here. There's a hole in here. Are they audible? Are they not? So I build the filter, and I turn these on and off. I say, okay, there was a hole in here. If I compensate for it, one of two things happens. Either sounds better or sounds worse, because there's pretty big change in here. If it sounds better, it means the measurements were correct. If it sounds worse, then I say, some bad measurements I'm not understanding. It's a complex sound field, hitting the walls and everything. But I tell you, what folks are doing for evaluating speakers subjectively is beyond, my comprehension and logic of how you can take a speaker like this and praise it as perfect with zero flaws. How does, if this is perfect, what is imperfect? What could you have done worse than this to make this imperfect? I just can't fathom how a speaker little like this, so inefficient, could have a lot of bass. How could it have a lot of bass? You have no power, it's just so inefficient. and it's sloping down. No way does it go down to 20, 30 hertz or whatever. I mean, you're just way down here, and it's overwhelmed by the highs. I mean, now going back to BMW, I mean, my request to them is, first, if they think these things are wrong, go ahead and publish your own measurements. Contact me. I'd love to know that I'm wrong about these things. Don't just talk about the drivers and what material goes in the woofer. I don't care what material goes in that woofer. If it resonates and it bottoms out, it's broken. I'm not here to design speakers. It's their job. Don't tell me about how hard you worked to do that. I mean, I don't want to know whoever mixed sand to build the brick that went on our house. You know, I just want to know that the brick is mounted straight and the house is not going to fall over. Yeah, you have a tweeter which has very low distortion, but why in the heck did you create a hole in here and a peak in here and all these resonance peaks? What school of acoustics have they gone to? Which papers, which research? You know, we've been building speakers for a century almost. It is not a new thing. People have really spent time analyzing these things to find out what's a good speaker, what's a good bad speaker, what sounds good, what doesn't sound good. You know, if you're going to violate that so dramatically, give us some insight, give us a paper, you know, bring in a panel, listeners, do something rather than saying, oh my gosh, aren't we great? We sold 1 million of these speakers. We got this other one. We're going to call it the anniversary edition. But golly, don't do anything to smooth out this response. I mean, they're DIYers who can go in and improve the response of the speaker. I mean, I'm not a speaker designer. My specialty is understanding speaker performance, but not in going designing. But even I know I can go in there, put a resistor in line with a tweeter, pull this sucker down here, at least not have your ears bleed. And by the way, anytime you pull these things down, distortion goes even lower. It's one benefit of pulling these peaks down is that you're not asking the speaker to work as hard, so you're pulling those down, so you actually get better performance. Anyway, very disappointing. Major company, British company with decades of experience in this day and age where the science is so well understood as far as the principles of what you shouldn't do wrong. Million ways to design speakers to fit that principle, by the way, so it doesn't stifle innovation whatsoever. As you know, there are a million speakers looking like this. But don't go, you know, take every piece of music I listen to and you say, I'm going to decide, I'm going to change the tonality of everything Amir listens to because just me, you know, I'm BMW, I'm going to tell you that your music should have this kind of mishmash. I wonder if they think this is great, whether all of their speakers are identical response. Some tells me that there isn't. It's just these errors that they're letting through. Anyway, I'm ranting a lot. You know, according to my opinion, objective, subjective, listen test, everything that I can do to analyze a speaker tells me this is absolutely the wrong speaker. The reviewers who are saying these are top, you know, best of 2020, I just can't fathom. They're doing a disservice to their audience, to their viewers, and steering towards, you know, technology just doesn't give you good sound in your room. Get a proper speaker, enjoy and sit back, and you have a lifetime investment because these speakers don't become obsolete. They don't need DACs and format supports and things like that. Until they fall apart, they can give you 20, 30 years of good experience. Get one that's properly designed, that's objectively great and subjectively great. It is not hard. I must have tested 30 to 40 speakers in a year alone that meet both of those criteria. Get an active speaker instead of these little things. They're just beautiful. Many of them are just designed to have the right combination of amplification, crossover, and what have you. Anyway, you can tell I have strong feelings about this. I'll stop the video at this point. Thanks for watching and see you in a future video. Bye-bye.